our collective mental respite has never been more apparent or more urgent than it is right now. I mean, the fragility of our generation's mental health remains seen in the data and felt in our most immediate familiarities with the struggle for productivity, the struggle for stability, but most importantly, the struggle for happiness. While general exposure to mental health awareness is becoming a lot more popularized as people share their struggles, their diagnoses, and their stories online, so too are the modern day online apostles to certain intellectualists who, through science, vigor, and genuine passion for the therapeutic realm, founded the strategy's intention to heal the discomposed psyche. But clearly, something isn't working. We are becoming lifelong patients of an industry that, while there obviously exist some agents who truly do want the best for their patients, was never built on foundations truly intentioned to free those under severe psychological strain. Because the psychoanalytic world is dark, it is disturbed, it is racist, and it is sex-obsessed. This particular video is an investigation into many of the psychoanalytic ideas so many have deemed crucial, fundamental to their quote-unquote doing the work, healing their inner child, resolving their trauma, all credible because they spilled from the minds and writings of Jung, Freud, and others. Further examples of Anglocentric figures idolized far and wide, who, if you're not convinced by the end of this video, are in and of themselves ironic examples of the severest of sick mental states they claim to understand the curative potential of, then, well, therapy and morality, to be completely honest, might be beyond you. As well, quite honestly, as my patients. So, without further ado, let's begin. I have to begin this video with what informs our interest in psychoanalysis, and that is the mystery of our appetites, and what experiences, objects, and people in this life inform certain satiety. There is something so uncontrollable about this part of human nature, and I think that is most expressly manifest in, the most randomest of thoughts that intrude upon us during the day, but most brilliantly at night. Our dreams, right? The unconscious, the most disordered aspect of our nature, was the interest of both Jung and Freud in understanding how people's desires work, and consequently inform their mental condition. Even the desires, of course, that they're not fully conscious of. There is a lot to be revealed about a person just by observing their unconscious fantasies. Mainly an interpretation to creationist myths, the architecture of the universe, the great flood, the creation of a human being from mud, rely on this idea of there existing some disordered, dark, primitive potential, and by some mysterious disruption made into something intelligent and structured. The issue though, my issue with this entire concept is the extension of this idea into worldviews where they need not be. Freud, in particular, applied his psychoanalytic ideas to cultures understood by, in his estimation, to be primitive. You have to understand that according to Freud and other intellectuals at the time, these people weren't just theoretical representations, right? These were quite literally instantiations in human beings of disordered potential in dire, tragic need of an intelligent organizer. Because, again, according to Freud, Europeans are in a higher rung of psychological development. As he writes in his book Totem and Taboo in 1913, the primitive culture's practices are in and of themselves archaic forms of mental processes. Jung's ideas around the collective unconscious also interpreted a hierarchy of cultural utility, which speaks to and of course rationalizes the civilized European mind ordering the archaic primitive state of being. You see, the psyches of non-Western people were closer to the unconscious, the dream state, whilst Europeans had developed more conscious, rational minds, which actually explains much of Jung's fascination with Eastern/African mysticism. Because fundamentally, as flawed as the logic obviously is, I hope it's making sense, the lower rungs inform the higher rungs. And there are certain enlightenment, certain true knowing of oneself, especially so in context to the complex world around him, and consequently certain power in being able to utilize unconscious energy. And this unconscious energy is represented in the quote-unquote primitive cultures as he details in his book. I do encourage you to read those quotes, but I hope you are seeing how intellectually persuasive these ideas were and obviously remain to be quite persuasive today. More disturbing, at least to me, however, is the obsession of certain related figures like Magnus Hirschfeld with sexual expression in these related cultures. In 1933, the Nazi regime conducted a notorious book-burning campaign that targeted works deemed quote-unquote un-German. And these obviously included the writings and research in relation to Hirschfeld. To give you an idea of what kind of research I am talking about here, we are looking at numerous detailed accounts, memorabilia, erotic imagery, and the study of these primitive cultures' sexual behavior, and specifically in Africa. But all of this leads me to my final comment on why I believe Freudian orthodoxy was, and potentially remains, never truly intentioned to free those under severe psychological strain that he claimed to so honestly sympathize with. And I say this because he protected the agents of their very suffering. And most importantly, he compromised the integrity of his theories for that very motivation, at the expense of not only the victims of this obsessed pedophiles and pseudo-advocates for sexual freedom, but also at the expense of those of us, many generations down the timeline, who would go on quite naturally and in the name of science to absorb his ideas as doctrine. I think what distempers me most about the psychoanalytic industry is how steeped its founders were in their own addictions. And for some reason, with industries of similar scope and influence, it always seems to boil down to some insatiable appetite for sex. It always boils down to some strange concerted effort to normalize the ever more unconventional sexual craving. A campaign to normalize stretching the bounds of appropriate sexual pleasure. You see, the thing is, Freud's intimate collaborations with intellectuals interested in the ever-expanding and ever-disturbing scope of sexual indulgence is to be noted, of course, with equal attention to his own particularized sexual niche within the psychoanalytic realm, which happens to be the Oedipus complex, but we're not quite there yet. Not only was one of Freud's closest associates and contributors to psychoanalysis a pedophile, his own son from childhood, but he took no issue in allowing fleas to experiment on his nose and sinuses to cure a supposed neurosis, in investigation to some sexually adjacent theory postulating some connection between the nose and genitals. But also, of course, the experiments necessitated the nose mucosa be anesthetized with cocaine because research, of course. It's science, guys. Of course, cocaine was absolutely necessary. Formerly the director of the Sigmund Freud archives, Jeffrey Moussan essentially uncovers within his book a more troubling absence of integrity as it relates specifically to Freudian orthodoxy. Namely, Freud uncovered that much of the mental disturbances and disorders within his patients were more often than not related to some form of sexual abuse. Now, this was Freud's original seduction theory, and yes, there were two. And what is incredibly disturbing about this is that they need not have been more than one. See, when your theory poses as a direct threat to the intellectuals around you, it is simply not going to survive any scrutiny, and specifically the scrutiny of the National Institute of Psychiatry. So what do? You disseminate the idea that children fantasize their own sexual abuses. Can you see how we're going back to this idea of the disordered, primitive motivations, uncontrollable, by the way, of the unconscious? Anyway, you dress up this idea, you say more explicitly that the events of that these patients are reporting to you are indeed just fantasies, and you structure a rational theoretical framework to support this idea. Stay with me as we analyze the growth of this transformation. So, in the late 19th century, Freud proposed the first seduction theory, which essentially just posited that many cases of hysteria and neurosis in his female patients were rooted in actual experiences of abuse from specifically and sickeningly their own fathers. And you'd be surprised at how common this phenomenon was. The phenomenon specifically of fathers being common perpetrators of their own children's irreparable mental damage. And after all, Freud should know for himself because he knew the scope of his own father's darkness. Yes, by Freud's own admittance, his own father was indeed a pedophile. And it is so strange and heartbreaking, actually, how one really struggles to detangle themselves from such circles in associates and friends and other people that one surrounds themselves with. I mean, they just swarm the industry, these types of sick people. Freud, by pressure of his own internal conflicts, being a victim himself, and the pressure of the disgruntled community, introduced the Oedipus complex, which posited that children harbor unconscious desires for the parent of the opposite sex and aggressive impulses towards the parent of the same sex. This allowed him to explain the neuroses that, like his patients, he went on to suffer from. But of course, it's not personal, it's completely scientific. This theory explains the incumbent mental disorders through internal conflicts, right? Internal fantasies rather than the real external traumas that did occur, essentially replacing real abuse with fantasy-driven conflicts. This video would not be complete without me sprinkling in some necessary sexism, but in my personal opinion, this particular theory has far more severe and complicated implications in the 21st century, especially so with the embracement of different sexual identities and the further idealization of figures like Freud. I introduce to you penis envy, a period in a woman's psychosexual development as rigorously researched by Freud to support a woman's severe and tragic feelings of deprivation upon stumbling across the anatomical superiority of a man and suffering mentally for the fact that they, unfortunately, do not have a penis. This period, according to Freud, is most commonly observed in a woman's youth as she struggles with her sexual identity, and I do feel that a lot of you are smart enough to see how far-reaching, how delicate, and how prickly this final idea I've just presented is. I don't think I need to say more for you to see the implications and how messy all of this is becoming. Honestly, like I said, you're smart, and I think I've given you more than enough to chew on for today. But I think I've given you a lot to think about. I think I've been talking for a long enough period of time. I've said more than enough. It's time for you to make up your own opinions. Tell me what you guys think about this. But for now, I will hopefully see you next time. You take care and goodbye.